Welcome back. This is Breezing Through, and I'm Emily. So today I want to talk about something that I've actually worked on in the past, but it's a new way of me using this medium. So we're going to talk about epoxy resin. And in the past, I've usually used it on wood, but today I'm using it a little bit differently. So I have a lot of Polish pottery dishes. So this is made from a very specific kind of clay that is found in a very small part of Poland on the border with Germany. And this was introduced to my family in the 80s or the 90s. Like, we've had it for years. Almost all of my dishes are Polish pottery. There's really, unless it's plastic. And we absolutely love it. And every now and then, a piece will break. And sometimes you can put it back together and it's fine. And you can't put it in the dishwasher anymore because this stuff it's like magic. Between the clay and the glaze they use, you can bake with this. You can put it in the microwave. You can put it in the freezer. You just can't put it straight from the freezer into the oven. We've learned that the hard way. But we have so much of this, and my mom has enough to open her own store. But sometimes a piece breaks and you can't put it back together. Like, it just shatters. And historically, my mom has used those pieces to create flower pots. She makes these mosaic flower pots, and they're beautiful. But she wanted to do something a little different. She bought these 2 trays, and she wanted to make the bottoms of them mosaic Polish pottery. So let's get started. I'm going to show you how I did it, how I messed up, and how I fixed it, and how they worked out. So first, my mom came up with the designs for each one of these trays, and she would lay them out and kind of play around with them a little bit. And then once she got them exactly how she wanted them, she glued each individual piece down so they weren't going anywhere. So she did this really long one that's blue and yellow, and then the round one is the blue and white one, which I love that pattern. It's gorgeous. So all I'm doing here is pouring enough epoxy resin to cover the very top of the pottery. I don't want these to be super deep because she is going to be using these trays for things. As always, when using epoxy resin, it is super important to use all of the safety equipment. So I am wearing a respirator, goggles, I'm wearing gloves, and I was sure to mix everything together for 3 minutes, scraping the bottoms and the sides. This is a 1-to-1 epoxy that I'm using, so it's super easy when measuring it out. After I did this first pour, I came back and noticed that there were these bubbles on the trays, which I have never experienced before doing this with just wood. I think because the pieces of pottery were glued down, air got trapped underneath them and then bubbled up. So I'm going to do something that looks incredibly terrifying. And honestly, I was terrified when I did it because I've never done this before. But I have this really nice handy little sander that I used. It comes with 80, 120, and 220 grit sandpaper. And I just started sanding down where all the bubbles were. I actually sanded down the entire piece just to make everything look a little bit more even. But I really went pretty intense on where the bubbles are. And the one bubble that was such a bummer was the one that was just on the edge of the round piece in the middle. It made me so mad. Anyway, so once I got those sanded down, I then went through with a toothpick to get out all of the residue. Also, when sanding, it is also super important to wear a respirator and goggles as well, because you do not want to be inhaling this stuff. Some of the bubbles were just going to be too deep for me to get to without completely sanding this all the way down. So I did the best that I could, and I definitely learned that I need to get a heat gun, because even if the box says bubble free, the epoxy resin isn't necessarily bubble free. After sanding, I would then wipe it down with a damp paper towel so I could see what I was working with, and then use a toothpick again to kind of get residue out of where the bubbles were. And then I just kept repeating the process of sanding, pulling out the residue, and wiping it down with a damp paper towel until I felt like I'd gotten enough of the bubbles sanded down far enough in the epoxy. The nice thing about epoxy is that it will self-level when I re-pour it. When I was done, I wiped it down with some denatured alcohol because that gets up all of the additional dust and residue that's still on the tray, and I didn't want anything left on there for when I did the next epoxy pour. Once I was done with the round tray, I moved on to the really long skinny tray, and I will say this one was a little bit harder because the bubbles on this one were in kind of a clump and they were deep. And so I had to do a lot more sanding than I was expecting. And this one looked so much scarier than the round one did, even when I had it all prepped for the next epoxy pour. And I even had wiped it down a billion times and had gotten all the residue out and wiped it down with the denatured alcohol. It was so cloudy because of all the sanding. And everything that you see online says that it's not a big deal. It looks really scary. And once you got it all cleaned up and you do the next pour, everything's going to still be clear. So it's not a big deal, which is nice to hear. But at the same time, it's still terrifying because I'd never done it before. And I didn't know for 100% sure that I hadn't completely ruined this piece that had these really pretty Polish pottery pieces in it. So I was terrified, but I got it all prepped. I scrubbed it so well. I even used my DeWalt blower and I blowed off a bunch of residue as well. You can use those cans of compressed air to get stuff out as well. I just didn't have one on hand, didn't feel like going to buy one. So once everything was all ready, I then went and did a second pour of epoxy on both trays. And here's the moment of truth. You can see that in fact, the internet was right. Even though I sanded, when I put down another epoxy pour, everything was clear and smooth and pretty, and it wasn't cloudy and it wasn't scary looking anymore. So I can confirm, I promise it does work to sand your epoxy resin and then do a pour on top, and it still looks professional and finished and clean. Can you see why I was really nervous about this longer tray? It was so cloudy, but once I put the epoxy on, everything looked good and beautiful, and I was no longer panicking. For the trays, since I was only trying to cover up the bubbles and all the sanding, I did as thin of a pour as possible. Every epoxy is different. It will tell you in the instructions how thin of a pour you can do. So I just followed the directions that came with this specific epoxy resin, and I did that thin of a pour because I'm not trying to fill these up all the way fully cured. Otherwise, it can get kind of squishy and it doesn't cure right and it smells. I've done it. It's not good. I try to have at least 4 days between pours just to be on the safe side. Really like how these turned out, especially for a first try. So what do you think? I have to say I was so nervous when I found those bubbles. Usually when I've worked with wood in the past, I haven't gotten bubbles that big without catching them first and being able to get rid of them. And so having to sand them down and then clean them out and refill them was terrifying, because everywhere I saw on the internet said, oh, you'll sand it down and re-pour. And even though it looks really scary once you've sanded it down and really cloudy, everything will look perfectly clear once you re-pour. I'm not sure I really believed that. I definitely didn't believe it until I actually did it, because it's terrifying looking, especially that yellow tray. I was not convinced that was going to look good. I will say there's still some bubbles in the trays. I really just took out the bubbles on the first probably 1/4 of an inch. There were a lot more bubbles that popped up because of gluing those Polish pottery pieces down. Air was trapped underneath, and so the bubbles came up, and I just could not sand all the way down. If I had it, would have had to start completely over again. So this was a good lesson. We're going to play with it a little bit more and see what else we can do to keep that from happening in the future. So if you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe so you can see more of me in your feed, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.